And for those of you who don't know, we sort of collate and manage wildlife records from across Devon, and then yes, make them available to various groups and people. And we've got something upwards of about 5.5 million records that we manage, which we're continuously adding to. So I'm very pleased to be here this evening to talk about invasive species and the Ennis project, which has been doing some really good work. So first of all, what is an invasive species? And I thought I'd break it down into these three sort of questions and work out what is a native species, non-native, and then what makes that non-native species actually invasive. So first of all, native species are those who've been present in Britain since the last ice age. So 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the ice retreated, what was here then is classed as native. So that includes species such as water voles and our English and sessile oak trees as well. So once the ice was gone and we were cut off from the rest of Europe, any species that came to our shores after that is classed as non-native, and most of them have been introduced by people. Some of them have been around for quite a long time, so that includes rabbits, horse chestnut, and even the house mouse. From about 1800, there were only a few species, about 100 or so, and that number has now risen to, I think it's at least 2,000 at the last sort of count. A lot of that is due to greater international travel. We're trading a lot more and able to do, lots of things being shipped around the world. So what makes one of these non-native species invasive? And it's actually the impacts that it has on our environment, on our economics, socially, and only sort of 10 to 15% of those 2,000 species are actually classed as invasive. And they're species such as the American mink, which has been a key factor in the decline of water voles. Water voles actually declined by sort of up to 90% or more, and 20 years ago or so were actually declared extinct in Devon. So that's a massive impact from American mink, which were released from fur farms only a few decades ago. Japanese knotweed, which we'll talk about more this evening, that costs about £166 million annually to the UK economy, and it can go through hard surfaces, like it can go through concrete. So it's really, really difficult to get rid of. And rhododendron, another one that we've all seen lots of just as we drive around. I'm always seeing it on the sides of the roads as I drive around Devon. And that one, again, to control only about 2.5% of the spread of rhododendron, it costs £9 million a year. So these are really kind of expensive impacts on these species. And the total cost of all of the invasive species can reach, and I think it's actually topped about 1.7 billion, and that's annually. A lot of that is species that are linked with agriculture, so invasive weeds and pests. So with all these species, what can we do? There's prevention. So often species enter the UK through sort of the more industrial and commercial routes, but we can all play a role in prevention, such as, with plants, looking at what we've got in our garden, what we're going to put in our garden and where they come from, because that's not just the plant species, but also the pests that might come in those plants when you buy them and put them in your garden. Biosecurity, particularly with some of the waterborne invasive species. So boats need to be careful, and we should all really be washing our boots between the places that we visit. As you'll hear this evening, many of the species only require like a tiny fragment to actually spread and reproduce. And then there's management and control, which we will just touch on lightly. But what I'm mostly going to be talking about this evening is the recording side, and in particular the identification of these species, so that you actually can record them and know what you're recording. So Holly has already given a bit of an introduction to the Ennis project, but there's lots of really good information on their website about what they're doing. Really worth a look. So on to the actual plant species, well, mostly plant species. There are a couple of others in there as well. So category A, so Exmoor's most wanted invasive species. Wanted as in want to know where they are, not because we actually want them. And we'll be going through these ones first. So as Holly said, there's more than one species of knotweed. So we'll be looking at these four first. Japanese knotweed. I think this is probably the invasive species when it comes to the botanical species that most people are familiar with. It's the most widespread, originates, as the name suggests, from Japan, but apparently in Japan it's actually a bit of a rarity. Here it grows to about 2 meters tall. It's got really extensive system of rhizomes and roots. One of the problems with this, as with many of the species that we'll talk tonight, is that it just needs a little fragment of those roots, rhizomes, for it to be able to propagate again somewhere else. As long as that fragment ends up in somewhere that is makes it viable to grow, it'll do that. They prefer full sunlight, so you're mostly going to find them out in the open rather than within woodland. And there's a quite distinctive growth pattern with the stems. So you can see in this picture that the stems, they're not really branched, they come straight out from the centre. And on each node, so this is a node here, you'll get one leaf. But what that does is, because the leaves alternate, you get this kind of zigzag on the stem, and that's quite definitive of Japanese knotweed. The leaves are green, but the stems are slightly red. The leaves themselves they're smooth, and their shape is they're pointed. And then when it comes to the stem where the leaf joins the main branch, the edge of the leaf it's what's called truncate, so it's quite flat. And I just say that because some of the other species have got a slightly heart-shaped top to their leaf there, or base to their leaf, I should say. So this is often sort of compared to like a kind of spade shape. It produces these sort of loose clusters or panicles of tiny kind of creamy white flowers, and they come out in the sort of late summer, early autumn, so we're not really quite there yet. We only have the male plant in the UK, so it doesn't actually produce seeds. So it is purely those fragments, the fragmentation of the main plant that is the way that it spreads. In my experience, I've often seen it kind of along railways or sort of disused areas where it's obviously broken up and found somewhere to settle. And oh, I'm sorry, this one's overlaid the more detailed pictures. So this is the Himalayan knotweed. I apologise for that photo malfunction. This one's got very different leaves, so they're longer and thinner. Looks a little bit like the next knotweed that we'll talk about, which is the lesser knotweed. But this one originates from the Himalayas, as is suggested in the name. I don't think the names are particularly imaginative when it comes to these knotweeds. It's not very common in the UK, but it is more prevalent in the southwest. So as with Japanese knotweed, it can get to sort of 1.8, 2 meters high. But with these ones, the stems, you can just about see the stems here. The stems are green and they're quite hairy. And you get this brown kind of sheath at the base of the leaf as well. The leaves are much darker green and they're slightly kind of thicker, so leathery. And these ones have got the heart-shaped base. You can probably just about see it on this little fragment of the photo behind. The flowers are pale pink or white and bloom again in late summer or autumn. But again, they don't produce seeds, and reproduction is purely from those fragments of the rhizomes or indeed from the stems. So where they've got these nodes here on the stems, you just need a bit of that, and that will be able to reproduce into a new plant. They're quite common in riparian areas along waterways, and they were first recorded in the wild in the UK in 1917, and they were actually recorded in North Devon. So they've been in the area for quite a while. Our next knotweed, lesser knotweed. This one again from North India and sort of southwest of China. It's slightly less invasive. It doesn't quite have that kind of that spreading figure that the other species do. You can probably see better in the next slide actually that the leaves have got a slightly red tinge to them with the on their veins, and the underside of the leaf, I'm afraid I don't have a photo of the underside, but they're much paler and they're covered in slight, so very fine, very pale hairs, so it's kind of got a slightly felty feel to it. And in this species, that sort of zigzag that you get with the Japanese knotweed is very definitely not there. So the next one, giant knotweed, looks a lot more like Japanese knotweed than the previous two, but as you can see from this picture, it is considerably larger. So whereas Japanese knotweed only grows to about 2 meters high, this can reach 4 or 5 meters high, and the leaves are so 3 times as large as those of Japanese knotweed. One of the differences as well, so these leaves have got a slightly heart-shaped base to them as well, but they're pointed at the tips. So at first glance may look similar, but they've got a slightly different shape and obviously much, much larger. The flowers are quite similar again to the Japanese knotweed, but they're kind of greeny white colour and again much larger. It's quite widespread across the UK, but it isn't nearly as common as the Japanese knotweed, which is a species that can actually hybridize with. So you can get hybrids between the giant knotweed and Japanese knotweed. This knotweed does produce seeds, but it seems that they're not particularly viable here. So although it does produce seeds, you don't often get seedlings. So again, it's that fragmentation that really sees the spread, which is why it happens kind of along waterways, because they're such a good way of spreading these fragments of plant so they can land somewhere else and grow. And with this species, it does actually get eaten by the cattle, sheep and horses. They will eat it, but it doesn't really affect the plant very much. It might just keep it at bay briefly. So on to some of the other species. Got American skunk cabbage. Now this one, completely different shape. It's got a kind of rosette of these basal leaves that can, over the course of a season, grow up to 1 meter long. And they produce these flowers. So here is one of the flowers. They look a little bit like the flowers that you get in Lords and Ladies, but they're much, much larger. And they emit a really strong odour, like a skunk. So again, that's why skunk is in the name. And here we've got more photos. So you can see here, you know, they're really large. This is a quite a large fern, and they are easily as large as that. Montbretia, native to southern and eastern Africa, has been around and in the wild for over 100 years in this country. It's really, really common in gardens. I have some in my garden. The leaves, when they first grow, can look a little bit like an iris because it is it's in the same family as the irises. So you get that kind of quite flattened growth in spring. But once it starts flowering, those bright orange flowers that grow on these long stalks make it really quite unmistakable. It doesn't so much spread quickly as it reproduces really quickly. So they've got these little bulbs and they just reproduce, and the thickets get just thicker and thicker and thicker, which is how it kind of slowly spreads out. It's also one of the reasons that probably why it's ended up in the wild, because if you've got it in your garden, it just gets thicker and thicker. Then at some point you want to thin it out, and some people unfortunately do just dump garden waste out in the wild, and these plants just very, very happily grow. They really like the southwest. because they're not very resistant to frost, and we don't have huge amounts of frost here, and it also likes the sunshine, which I believe we have some of, even though I haven't seen it for a couple of days. There are several species of hybrids, so that's what the scientific name up here shows, that it is frequently hybridized. There's another species that I understand has sort of been flagged up as being of interest, which is called Montbretia, which is very similar, but with even deeper orange flowers. Oops. Here's one that another species that everybody knows, Himalayan balsam, from the Himalayas. It's also sometimes called Indian balsam. Introduced as a garden plant almost 200 years ago now, very soon escaped into the wider countryside. And you can see why it was brought in and planted in gardens, because it is quite a beautiful plant, these lovely pale pink flowers. It's spread across much of the UK, and it was very good to hear that in Exmoor the management and control of it has been going really well, and it's really reduced in number and spread. It thrives in damp places, so that's why you find it frequently along riversides, but I've also seen it along roads where you get a ditch. Once it's found its way there, as long as that ditch stays nice and wet, it'll thrive there too. The flowers are the easiest way to identify it, but ideally, particularly with management, if you're going out and pulling up balsam, then you really want to get there before the flowers have started, because you want to get there before the seeds arrive. And so you can tell it because it's got these often really quite red and hollow stems, and the leaves themselves are they're serrate at the edge and elliptical. And all these flowers, when they do come, they come right at the top of the stem. And with these, the seed heads, the reason why you want to get there before they appear, if you're trying to manage this species, is because these seed heads here, once they're ripe, they literally sort of burst with seeds, and that's usually done on contact. So once they're touched, they'd burst, and they can throw their seeds up to 7 meters. So that really does, help them spread. And each plant can produce about 800 seeds. So that, that shows why it is such a problem. But as has been happening on Exmoor, with really targeted management, because it's an annual, so getting there and pulling them up repeatedly each year really can make a difference. Holly mentioned this one as well, the giant hogweed. Comes originally from Central Asia, introduced, as with all of these, really as an ornamental plant for gardens. It's quite striking. It's really tall, so it can actually, I think they've been recorded as being up to 5 meters, which is absolutely enormous. And the leaves themselves can be sort of between 1.5 and even their maximum up to 3 meters long. So really is giant. It forms the sort of classic umbellifera flowers at the top, but these arrive in the second year. So in the first year you get these rosettes, like you do with our normal native hogweed. You get these rosettes of basal flowers growing, but whereas our native hogweed's got quite sort of rounded edges to these lobed leaves, these ones are really quite pointed, so much more jagged, really large, and yeah, really quite different from the native hogweed. The stems, however, are quite similar, so they're hollow, they're green with sort of purple blotches, and really thick ridges around the edge, but just on a totally different scale. Let me see what else. The small flowers that you get on the umbels all point upwards, so that's something, that particularly if you just see a bit of it, can separate it out from some of the other umbelliferas, if not just the size. One thing you have to be careful of with giant hogweed is that it contains a sap, which has a chemical in it, which I will do my best to pronounce. I've got it in my notes here. Furocumarin, something similar to that anyway. And it's a phytotoxin, which means that once you get it on your skin and then you expose that to sunlight, it can really, really burn. And I think I've actually had this before on holiday in France in the sun, and my skin blistered and it was really, really unpleasant. So definitely something to be careful of. If you spot it, don't get that sap on your skin. Here's a species that I have seen up in the Exmoor area, Fringecups, originally from the sort of western parts of North America, where there's sort of quite similar sort of climate. So they feel really, really at home in our damp woodlands here in well, Devon and Somerset on Exmoor. Introduced to the UK about 150 years ago. They have round, slightly lobed leaves and tall flowers with little bell-shaped delicate flowers. Sorry, tall spikes with little delicate flowers on them. These initially start off kind of greeny white, and then as the plant matures, they turn pink. They really are very, very delicate though, so you have to look quite closely to see the colour. Once these flowers have sort of summer's over, you can still see the dry stems in the autumn and through into the winter. And these are height-wise, they're kind of maybe above the knee, thigh height. And they spread really, really easily along waterways, and they can form huge, huge swathes. So these are just a few clumps, but I don't think you can quite see in this photo that actually most of that is also Tellima as well. These were both taken in the Heddon Valley, and we've actually got our survey results here, and you can almost see how they spread. So the red is where they are most prevalent, and then the orange and the yellow, and then finally the green. But this is the main focus of the area, and you can see how they've spread down the stream, and this goes all the way out to the sea, and they do get less and less prevalent as they head towards the sea. So there's very definitely a focal point here. And our first non-plant species is the signal crayfish. And so here we have the signal crayfish, and the easiest way to show you the difference between the invasive species and our native white-clawed crayfish is by looking at the underside. So the signal crayfish, you can see the very obvious difference at first is the underside of the sort of front claws are really red, whereas in the white-clawed crayfish, again, clues in the name, they're really pale, not red at all. Other differences are that signal crayfish can grow much larger, so they can get to kind of over 12 centimetres. Excuse me. Whereas the white-clawed crayfish are much smaller and rarely go above 12 centimetres. They're found throughout our waterways, and they were introduced, I think, back in the 70s or so for commercial farming. But what happened is they escaped, and they not only spread disease as they kind of spread throughout the waterways, those disease sort of really harmed the white-clawed crayfish, and they can outcompete them. They are sort of quite predatory, the signal crayfish, and they'll eat sort of frogs and fish, and they'll even eat other signal crayfish. They can cause other problems. So, for example, burrowing into banks can exacerbate erosion. Quick fact, they can live for 20 years and produce 400 eggs a year. So they, if one is feeling particularly productive through a lifetime, it really, really can spread. So that's the end of category A. I don't know if this is a good time to maybe pause and see if there are any questions. You might have to holler if there are questions, otherwise I will carry on with category B.
If anyone's got any questions, feel free to use the hand raise thing, or turn your camera on and wave manically, or whatever seems best suited to you.
I can't see everyone when I'm talking, so
or unmute and shout at us.
Either that or pop it in the chat, and I'm sure we'll find it later. Right, in that case, I will continue with the category B, which I'm afraid I've called Exmoor's second most wanted species. So these ones are ones that I think I believe they're kind of concern, but they're not the sort of the main ones that the NS team really want to know where they are, and you can help with locating and identifying them, recording them. So this is the monkey flower. It comes from the sort of western part of North America all the way up to Alaska, where it again finds similar climate here, and it really likes the damp places along streams and ditches, or even in sort of really wet fields. It's been around for a couple hundred years in this country, and it spreads both by seeds and vegetatively as well. So those fragments, again, as with the other species, those fragments can take root and produce new plants. It's a kind of short to medium plant. I'm afraid the photo I had didn't have its leaves in it. The leaves are oval and kind of irregularly toothed, and the lower leaves are stalked, whereas the ones higher up towards the flowers aren't. The flowers are bright yellow, and they've got these little red spots in, and it's really quite, you can, with a lot of these flowers, you can see why they were brought in to the country. It's a very attractive flower, and the flowers, you can see they're kind of slightly trumpet shaped, and they can be sort of anywhere between 2.5 to 4.5 centimeters long, and they flower July to September. It's also, I don't know if I said it's a hairless plant as well. We've got Himalayan honeysuckle, originally again from the Indian subcontinent, and first recorded in the wild a bit over 100 years ago. I found this out and about. It's got really quite unmistakable flowers. So these, they're sort of come down, they're really sort of pendulous. The white flowers grow in here, and then over the season they sort of they move as the older ones drop off and the new ones form. And the leaves are arranged in opposite to each other along the stalk. Again, heart-shaped, but really pointed at the ends. So it's quite easy to spot. So it's got that sort of honeysuckle formation with the opposite pointed leaves. Winter heliotrope. This, I think that, you know, I've seen this quite a lot, particularly exactly as this picture, along the sides of roads. It's from sort of North Africa, Mediterranean region, and it forms these huge swathes of really large round leaves. We've got a Jack Russell in the photo for scale. And for much of the year, it's just the leaves, and it actually flowers in the winter. And you get these quite sort of, well, tall compared to, because it's quite a low growing plant, spikes that come up, and on the top you get these clusters of a kind of dusky purple flower. All the plants that we have in the UK are male plants, so it doesn't reproduce through seeds. Again, it's another one where it disperses through fragments, like the rhizomes, roots, and particularly along watercourses. Laurel, goes by various names, so common laurel, cherry laurel, English laurel, recorded in the wild about 150 years ago, but it's actually only in the last 40 or so years that it's really kind of taken off in the wild. and that's probably because it's become more and more popular as a hedgerow plant in gardens. The leaves are toxic, so I don't believe there's anything in the UK that eats them. However, when these flowers are gone, it does produce fruits, and those will be eaten by birds, and that's how the seeds are distributed. So in terms of IDing it, the leaves are quite large. They're really glossy, and you can see that although the older leaves are quite dark green, when the newer ones form, they're much lighter, much more vivid green. And rhododendron, which again, another plant that we're all familiar with. You can see it, particularly when it's in flower, you can spot it from quite some distance. These big, really showy pinky purple flowers usually. This does quite well on in places like Exmoor and Dartmoor because it really likes acidic soils. And this is the one that it just rapidly spreads. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, it, you know, just trying to hold back the tide costs so much money to do. Each mature plant can produce, and it's millions of seeds each year. And those seeds can actually remain dormant for a few years in the soil, but still viable, so they can crop up later, even if you sort of, you know, get rid of the main plant. And this plant is originally from the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain, Portugal area. It's quite an attractive plant when all the berries are out. This is snowberry. It's a deciduous shrub. It can form sort of quite big thickets up to maybe 2-3 meters high. Although these leaves themselves are actually quite small, only 2 to 4 centimeters long. They're hairless and quite simple. The flowers, you can just see here, are pale pink. And when these go, you get these clusters of the white fruits. And these all form, so the flowers and the fruits all form right at the end of the branches. And with this, there's possibly because of the colour, I don't think we have anything like this native to the country, but birds just don't eat them. They don't like them. It usually spreads from suckers rather than the seeds. Obviously, if nothing's eating the seeds, they're not really getting distributed. So it forms suckers and spreads from that way. And our final species, and another one that isn't a plant again, is the Asian hornet. Now, whereas a lot of the plant species that I've mentioned have been in the country for 100 years, 200 years, this wasp was only first spotted in the UK in 2016. So it's been making its way kind of across various countries in Europe. And it's a predator of other insects, so including bees and social wasps, active in our summer months, and particularly towards the end of summer and early autumn, where, you know, after it's been the hive has sort of been multiplying. It's slightly smaller than our native hornet, and the main difference is the colour. So that's how you can tell quite quickly. Our native hornet is very, very yellow, whereas if you look on the abdomen here, you only get thin bands of yellow, and the thorax is completely black. So you get just one band that's thicker yellow, and in our native hornet, that would be the whole of the abdomen. It's also got the name of the yellow-legged hornet, which is, you can see why. It looks like the legs have been sort of dipped in yellow paint, whereas our native hornet, again, these are black. They come in and they kind of hunt down bees. As yet, I don't think they've had an enormous impact, and that's because there've been lots of initiatives to try and make sure that they're found and recorded, and then those hives are destroyed before they can have an impact. It doesn't seem that many things prey on them. So in France, where they've had them for a bit longer than us, they've seen woodpeckers and jays eating larvae from a nest, but only right at the end of the season. And where you find nests is usually around deciduous trees and occasionally around buildings, but there haven't been a huge number of sightings and nests in this country as yet, but it's definitely something that is on a watch list. So any questions, please pop your microphone on and shout. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to how to record these species. There is on the Exmoor National Park page a way of submitting a record of anything you see in the park. But for this project, the best way to record them and the most useful way is through iNaturalist, which is a recording app. You can download it, excuse me. You can download it onto your phone. And once you've downloaded it, if you look at projects, and you can either sort of search or look what's nearby, and you can find the Ennis project. And then I've already joined, so this says leave for me, but there's a little button here that you can press that says join. And that's a good way of being able to submit your records. So either individual records, which are really, really easy to put in. You can take a photo, pop in some notes. It'll tell you where you are, and it'll do a lot of that for you. But another thing, I think that possibly one of the Ennis team at the end of the talk can talk about it a little bit more, is doing walks and then recording every couple of 100 meters and just seeing if there are any invasive species where you're standing at that point, or if there's nothing, in which case nothing in terms of invasive species, in which case you can just record the most prominent species for native plants that's there. So there's a bit more information on that on the Ennis website.
And I'll just say, if you join that project on iNaturalist as well, in the journal there's a short video about how to do it and sort of the things to look at. So there's like a sort of, I think it's about 10-15 minute video in that, which should give you some training on sort of the best way to do it as well, which hopefully can be useful to people.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then finally, I said I'd just briefly touch on management. So for most of these species, management generally means ideally the sort of removal, or at least the control of the spread of these species. Traditionally, that's been done using some quite harsh chemicals, and some of the species really need a lot of repetitive treatment. And the Ennis project has been trialling a machine contraption, I don't know how to describe it, called Rootwave Pro, and it uses electricity rather than chemicals. So obviously within a national park it's not ideal to be using lots and lots of chemicals. So what it does instead is it sends electricity into the plant, which raises the temperature, and it effectively sort of boils the plant cells, which over time kills the plant. And that's something that's being trialled in Exmoor. But again, I'm sure that the Ennis team have a lot more information about that, and there's some more on their website. So that's the roundup of the species that we would love you to go and look for as you're out and about on Exmoor. So thank you very much, and I will hand back to one of the team. Thank you.
Now, we very cleverly organised our running order and how we were going to start, but we never thought about what we'd do at the end of the talk and who was going to take over this part. So if anybody thinks we're organised, I'm very glad you've got that misconception. It's the lies are working, obviously. Thank you very much, Jess. That was absolutely brilliant. It's nice to see all those different things and to pick up some of the ways to identify them and see the differences as well. Has anyone got any questions? There's nothing written down in the chat, I don't think, but if anyone's got any questions they would like to wave at the camera or just unmute to ask them, feel free. Okay, so we've got one question just coming in. As would diseases such as ash and elm, sort of I guess Dutch elm disease, I mean, be considered as an invasive species? Are the diseases a species? So that I guess that's the...
Well, a lot of it is I believe it's a fungus that you get a lot that creates issues, and those have been brought in from other countries. So that's where the biosecurity and knowing where your plants are coming from is really important. So that's how diseases like that do end up in the country.
So yeah, they are invasive species and they are damaging and killing off our local wildlife. I guess the Dutch elm disease that's a fungus as well, but it's carried by beetles, I think, from memory. But yeah, certainly the ash dieback is, like you say, is a fungus. One question I wanted to ask is are there any species, sort of particularly plant species, I think, that we ought to be worried about on Exmoor? Anything that we haven't got on our list that's on the way? Obviously, you talked about Asian hornets, which I guess is sort of that one thing that we know is on our doorstep and knocking on the door hard. But is there anything that perhaps this is an impossible question, anything we haven't thought of yet? If there is, we haven't thought of it, I guess is the answer.
I think that the list that you've got that we've run through tonight is probably a really good starting point. There's quite a lot of species on there, and those are ones that, again, for people who are going out for a walk, are quite easy to spot and identify. So that's a good way of getting people involved. There are, of the 2,000 or so non-native species and 200 to 300 invasive ones. I expect that there'll be others, maybe more insects or things on Exmoor, but they're probably much harder to find and identify.
Which is quite a nice thing with iNaturalist. So if you are out and about, I'll do the quick plug for this now. If you find something, I mean, obviously, from our point of view, we want people to record everything, but especially if you're out there and you think, oh, hang on, that doesn't look quite right. What is that? That looks a bit out of place. I've not seen that thing before. Snap a photograph of it, put it on iNaturalist. Even if you've got no idea what it is, there's various scary algorithms that will help you ID it, and also real life human beings that will take a look as well. And it may turn out to be just a rarity that we would quite like to know about because it's a wonderful rare thing that's native and brilliant. Or it might be, oh, hang on, this is something. Oh, this isn't supposed to be in this country. We weren't looking for this one because we didn't know it was here to be a problem. And it's things like that can be a bit of an early warning system. That they're, like I say, there's clever algorithms within iNaturalist that will help to flag some of those things up. And get us aware.
And the iNaturalist community will certainly help as well.
Yeah, I can say that we've had amazing help from all over the world. We've got sort of Chinese and Australians and Americans and French people and all over the world come in and help us with the ID sometimes.
No, it's definitely, I've coming from the Records Centre, I'm obviously an advocate for recording, but it's so important to know where these species are, because if you don't know where they are, then you can't make your plans, your management plans, or what to do, or even see how they're spreading over time. So it's really important to regularly, even if you go, oh, no, I've been down here and I've recorded before, if you go for a walk a few months later or the next year, still have a look.
I find it interesting. You can fill in all sort of the flowering times. So even if it's the same time next year, just saying, oh, the foxgloves are in flower a week earlier this year or a month earlier this year, or just those phenology sorts of things can be quite interesting. We've got another question in the chat, and I saw Peter had his hand up just a moment ago, so we'll come back to you in a second, Peter. But we've got Chris Sampson in the chat saying, what about grey squirrels? Is the battle lost there? Do we hang our hats in shame and just let them go? I don't know. Are there about to be reintroductions? I don't know.
I think it probably depends on who you ask about grey squirrels. Obviously, they've had a massive impact on our red squirrels, but they've been helped on the way by us not having other animals like pine martens around who can be who can really keep them on their toes, those grey squirrels, when they're about. So who knows? It's the problem with when you remove one species that's always been around, that can leave space for another species to come in. So it's trying to find the balance, I suppose.
There was an old lady who swallowed a fly.
Can be a bit like that, I think. Excuse me.
Peter, I saw you had your hand just up just now, but you put it down. If you want to come in, feel free to unmute and ask a question.
That was finger trouble at my end, operator error.
Okay, sorry, that's all right then. Any other questions, or is that us done? Kate.
Hello, Jess. Well done. Some brilliant descriptions. I'm amazed that the rabbit is considered threatened by the IUCN, and I know that I see very, very few rabbits these days. I wondered what they were like on Exmoor and if they're seen and reported a lot.
I'm afraid I don't have the answer for Exmoor and rabbits to hand right now.
We've still got rabbits.
But still got rabbits, but they are, I think because rabbits are one of those things that they're one of those species that people do think are everywhere and you see them all the time. But I'm sure that I've seen much fewer rabbits in the last few years than I used to. And what we find at the Record Centre is that a lot of the common species, or what we think of common species, people don't record. Which it's always good, obviously, to know where the sort of the sensitive species are, but the ones that we think of as being common is also they're really important to record, because when we do get these drops, because there is a I think it's kind of understood that there is a bit of a drop in rabbit numbers at the moment. Unless we regularly record things that we see all the time, we won't know that. So, although I can't answer for Exmoor in particular, I'm afraid, Kate.
No, I say that just locally close to where I live, the numbers have probably dropped off a little bit, but they are still here. When I first moved here 10 years ago, there were no rabbits. 5 years ago, there were rabbits. There were rabbits everywhere. You couldn't move for rabbits. Rabbits were a problem. At the moment, rabbit numbers are probably in a balanced state. I guess they will probably go down a little bit more and then suddenly explode again. They do tend to go up and down. I wonder if the IUCN listing, I didn't know that, to be honest with you, but that is obviously a global listing rather than a UK one, so it could be problems in their native range, and lots of these things can have problems in their native range. Like the conker tree, the horse chestnut, is on the IUCN list as well. So in iNaturalist, they blur the positions of conker trees in case anyone's trying to poach them or take them away, and it's like, no one's going to do that. But it's actually, I think it's a blight or a fungi that is attacking them, but not in the UK. So they're not threatened in the UK at all, but they are on international watch lists. And Leighton reassuring us there's also lots of rabbits where they live as well.
Good.
But aren't they invasive rabbits? I thought we wanted their population to crash. I'm confused.
No, they're classed as non-native, but they've been around for a long time. Only because they haven't been here. They weren't here at the end of the Ice Age. So
Okay,
it's a very long time ago that things are separated from native and non-native.
So this is where it gets, because hares are invasive technically. Well, no, or just non-native. I'm getting this wrong. They're also non-native, aren't they? Introduced.
It depends where you are. It's complicated. So rabbits are classed as invasive, but they are, as Jess said, a very integral part of the British landscape and have benefits too. So I guess it's all about management where you are, habitat impact, and hares are invasive in Ireland. So
yeah, it's a strange thing. If you go to Australia and say rabbits aren't a problem, they might have something to say to you, I guess. But I can't remember what it was. There's all sorts of things that we've got here that we're dealing with invasive species, and I've seen Americans and Australians saying, "Oh, but they're so rare here. You know, we're desperately trying to get them to live." And they say, "Oh, but you can take." I can't remember what the other species are, but the species that have come from the UK, which are now in America and Australia, that they're saying that we're saying, "Oh, but they're so endangered," and they say, "No, they're an invasive species. They're taking over here." So the whole of the world seems to be out of kilter with it.
I think it's the problem you get when you take a species and you put it somewhere that it hasn't been for thousands of years, and you get the balance with maybe not having predators, so they can run away. I mean, the sorry, I meant the population's running away in numbers rather than the actual animals running away. But for example, you know, rabbits have been here for a long time, and we have a lot of our native fauna that you know make good use of rabbits.
Definitely. This is my number one. I can see Tim's got your hand up, and we've got a question from Claire as well, so I'll come to those two in a minute. But this is my number one top fact that I was told by a mycologist a couple of years ago, is that there's a fungi which grows on marsupial droppings in Australia that has been found in rabbit droppings in the UK. So at some point, the rabbits that were taken from the UK and imported to Australia have picked up this fungus from marsupials in Australia, and at some point those rabbits have been brought back to the UK from Australia and released back into the wild to let that fungi back into our ecosystem in the UK. Wow. And it's like, I just wonder what was in someone's mind. It's like, oh, rabbits, yeah, we need rabbits in the UK. Let's get a sailing boat and go to Australia and bring some rabbits back. I have no idea how that it just boggles my mind. But in any case, so we've got a question from Claire to say there are lots of other, so are there other species on the NSS like holly and primrose? I guess they can be invasive, but native, I would say, are not a big problem, but they can also be put onto iNaturalist. Particularly dense stands of holly can be a problem with stopping other species of tree getting through sometimes. Is there anything else you'd like to say about either of those, Jess or Holly?
Pat, can I just come in there? I was just wondering, is that to do with, I wonder if they've looked at our NS project on iNaturalist and seen all of the other species that are recorded too. Obviously we're recording other species just to show where we've been. So I don't know if you want to go into a bit more detail about that.
So that's what I saw it on that list.
Okay, perfectly. So within the project, we're asking people to walk, as well as reporting the invasive species, that what's important is to see where people have surveyed. So if you're going deliberately surveying for invasive species, even if you don't find something, every 200 or 300 meters, log the most notable species that you find. Just to lay us sort of a set of breadcrumbs so we can see where you've been, and then we filter the invasive species out of that list. So we've got one map that shows all the dots where people have walked looking for invasive species, and then another map which shows where all the invasive species are, and then we can sort of direct volunteers to the gaps where nobody's looked at all to go and look there.
Okay,
Tim, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks very much. Great talk, Jess. Thank you very much. Green parrots are becoming quite common in South Devon, around the Plymouth area, and they tend to boot out all the hole nesters. I was wondering whether you've seen them very much on Exmoor. I'm in North Devon, South Molton. I've not seen them here, but whether they're localising anywhere else, be interesting to know.
I'm afraid that I don't have access to our database right at the moment, and I didn't look that one up beforehand. I know that there's a population increasing in Plymouth with it's the parakeets, isn't it? But I don't know where else they've gone. Obviously, I know they're famously in London, and they're in Plymouth. They've got to be in some places in between, surely.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't on my watch list anywhere, but.
Good. Okay, thank you.
I think maybe they do well in cities because people feed them as well. Just have something different to look at on the bird table.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right then. Any other questions? Or was that all done? Perfect. In that case, if there's no more questions, I'll say thank you very much to everyone for coming this evening. I'll just say to anyone else on the NS team, if anyone wants to come and say anything, otherwise we'll wrap up and say thank you very much everyone for coming this evening. Thank you massively to Jess for giving up your time and your evening to come and talk to us, and thank you to everyone else as well for coming to listen to us as well. like I say, we have recorded this evening, so we will, once it's done its business and downloaded, we'll email a copy of the talk that we've done this evening around to everyone as well.
Pat, just quickly, sorry.
That's okay.
I was just going to say, if anyone wants to get in touch with us, our contact details are on the website. I realise I'm not sure we've actually included them tonight, but we can also send round. But if you search for Exmoor Ennis online, you should find our website, and our contact details and much more information about the project is on there. Brilliant.
Perfect.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you very much. I shall now lead the charge of waving manically at the camera as no one quite knows how to say goodbye, and we will hopefully see you all again. Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you very much for coming.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.